the late 60s are the Beatles saying, say you want a revolution, right? So in the span of one decade, you can sense the cultural shift that occurs, right? So the 50s are going to be interesting for me because there's some of that kind of attitude going on, but it's behind the scenes. So we're going to be looking at the 50s as culturally and also as politically. And it's going to be one of the most complex decades we have because of all the different factors. Okay. So let's start with the study guide. And first of all, it is important that you know what the word affluence means. By far, America is going to be the most affluent country on earth in the 1950s. So if I were to type in most affluent country today, I want to see what they say. What is the most affluent country? I'm guessing it's still us, but I know that the standard of living is pretty high. Okay. So here's the Qatar is the richest country. I want to take the the Arab Emirates states, the Gulf states out of the equation because they got like 1,000 people and they all make $1 billion or something preposterous. But let's take a look at who else is on this. So we got Singapore. That's an interesting list. Switzerland, Kuwait, the Emirates, Norway, Ireland, Brunei, Singapore, Luxembourg, Macau, and Qatar. So we don't even make the top 10 anymore. And part of that has to do with the fact that there is a growing distribution of wealth in America between rich and poor, a huge gap that's getting even bigger every minute. Now, look at this stat. And I told y'all about this yesterday when we were talking about Levitt towns. An absolutely astonishing number of homes are going to be built during this period. So if you're reading about building construction, think about 15 million homes being built in the 50s, basically at one time, all right? And the Levitt towns were just one example of this mass construction. Keep in mind, construction is one of those great industries because it has this wonderful ripple effect all across the economy, from hardware stores or, lumber yards and masonry. It's just one of those things that employs lots of people in the service sector. So this is going to be a growing job area in home construction and design. And that's going to be a really growing characteristic of the 50s. Another huge aspect of the 50s is science. So to me, the 50s is the decade in which science becomes sort of fully realized in American history, where physics and astronomy and chemistry start to become actually meaningful to a whole lot of people. So talking about technology, you have the very first computer that is used by a business built and manufactured in 1951. It is built by the company, the International Business Machines. So International Business Machines, well, that's a mouthful, shrinks its name down to IBM. So IBM sells its first computer in 1951. So this is the dawn of the computing age. We've already mentioned the hydrogen bomb. Watson and Crick do DNA in the 50s. So that's a major breakthrough. I would like to underline and sort of bold this in a way, because I absolutely love Jonas Salk. Like, he is one of those rare people in history who are so deserving of praise to me. So Salk worked for the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. He worked at Johns Hopkins University as well. And polio was a scourge, right? Like, polio was this disease, this virus that was killing, or not killing, but well, in some cases killing, but really making the lives for tens of thousands of children miserable. And so when he develops this vaccine, and I don't know the virology research that he does, but when it works, he makes an astonishing decision. He does not patent it. He chooses to give away the polio vaccine. Like, he just gives it away. He allows like healthcare to just use it. Eisenhower is like, oh my gosh, that sounds like socialism or something. Even Eisenhower has got scrutiny over it. But this is one of the greatest contributions. And what he said is, I already have a nice home. I already have a nice job. I don't need any more money. And this will make it affordable for all these people to have, And so you get a polio vaccine when you're a baby, and ask yourself, when's the last time you heard someone having polio? And it utterly works. And the polio vaccine is an absolute success. Vaccinations are a success, and that tells that story. By the mid-50s, we are developing, and by the end of the 50s, we have built nuclear reactor war economy that emerges. It really is, unlike the Roaring Twenties, is not going to end in a sort of catastrophe like the Great Depression. So we were looking at scientific progress, and I'm going to talk to you a lot more about the development of NASA and rocketry a little bit later, as well as with astronauts and things like that. So another key area of growth in the American economy and industry is in the development of aviation and aerospace development. First aviation, and then by the end of the 50s, space studies. So I mentioned already that this is the Strategic Air Command. You should be familiar with this. This is the bomber wing of the Air Force that is our nuclear arsenal. Today, the nuclear arsenal of the United States is still handled by the U.S. Air Force. So the Air Force, which is a brand new, at that time, brand new part of the United States military, it is an offshoot of the Army. And so the Air Force would use these massive bombers. And remember the general who I told you his nickname was Bombs Away LeMay, the guy who coordinated the firebombing of Japan? Well, he's now the head of SAC. So, you know, during the Cold War, there was a fear by the Soviets of having SAC drop bombs on them, you know, so to speak, or drop our nuclear arsenal. But at the same time, you have the first major commercial aviation. So the Boeing Corporation will begin making airplanes. And this is what it used to look like to get on an airplane to travel, you know, and you would like line up by this kind of large stairway and enter up through the side of the, there were no, today, if you pull up to an airport, you'll go into the I guess what they call the big area, the terminal, and there's this sort of what looks like a tube that's connected to the side of the airplane, you know, and you walk down through that. But you know, times they have changed. Okay, now I've created a sort of collaborative, a collection of notes here to talk about things like the phrase white collar. The term white collar is tricky because white collar can mean managerial and professional, or it can also mean lower income clerical, right? So, you know, you can be a secretary and they call it a white collar job, or you can be a physician and they call that a white collar job. The major difference is from white collar and blue collar is manufacturing, it's industrial, it's assembly, it's kind of dirty work, to use that expression, like sweat work. And so what will emerge in the 50s is an idea that you want to be in the white collar, you know, although I got to tell you that a lot of blue collar people did pretty well too during this period. Companies grew even larger by swallowing up even other companies. So, you know, for example, General Electric, GE being one of the greatest, will end up owning a TV studio. You know, like GE and Westinghouse will own CBS. Like, what's that got to do with GE? But nonetheless, that happens. ITT was the international telephone company at that time, like AT&T. That was the other one. So we had lots of big conglomerates. And as I mentioned up here, most women who had worked during World War II had seen that as temporary. And they sort of went back to the home place, right? And made way for the veterans coming back. Like the Rosie the Riveters, they retired, so to speak, from riveting. But there was a whole new growth in what I tend to call the pink collar, which is traditionally at that time women's jobs. So when I talk to folks about why teachers don't get paid very much, it's like they don't seem to understand that for most of the history of education, teachers were women. And women were always paid a whole lot less than men. So women teaching was not particularly seen as the breadwinning profession back then. It was kind of like a supplemental income almost. But lots of domestic labor. That means like working in people's houses. I don't really use the word servant, domestic servant, but you know, these are people like housekeepers and maids, and you know, a lot of that started in the 50s because of affluence. People had money to pay people to clean their house, so they wouldn't have to clean it themselves. Okay, and of course they had new technology gadgets too, like the vacuum cleaner. And we're going to look at this major key component, and maybe you want to write this under American Zenith as like one of the key dynamic like phrases that you always need to remember about the 50s. It was a culture of conformity, overwhelmingly a culture of conformity. You know, when I see people following trends, part of me just sneers and disdain at that type of conformity. All right. Well, I do hate TikTok. I mean, honestly, I don't hate TikTok. I don't have any personal need for TikTok. People can use it if they want. I don't care personally, but if you're if your mannerisms and choices are dictated by what other people in society do, then I consider that utterly boring, right? Well, that was the 50s. The 50s were designed to be a conformity period. You were going to have a set sort of prescription for what society was supposed to be. Family unit, the nuclear family, it's called, housing. And, the definition was being an individual meant you were probably a communist. Being an individual meant you were an outcast. And so this is a period where particularly young people are going to sort of struggle with a sense of identity. And a lot of these young people who grew up in the 50s are going to resent their parents and become rebellious in the 60s. Now, most of them aren't that rebellious in the 50s, but by the time the 60s rolls around, you're going to see a whole lot more rebellion going on against this conformity. And this was a very, very large period of materialism. I'll show you a book in a little bit about this kind of development in American history and how we went from having sort of enough to be comfortable to having a demand for more and more and more. So sort of a consumption-driven society. The workplace, as I mentioned, you will see a remarkable downturn in manufacturing. In other words, the number of people. You won't see a downturn in manufacturing success. GE, Ford, companies like that are going to have great productivity gains, but it's in mechanization. The people are less necessary during this period. Okay, so millions of blue-collar jobs will kind of start to go away, but at the same time, millions of new jobs in the information sector will start to grow in computers and in sales and in advertising. And I mentioned this word consolidation up here. I thought I mentioned it. Oh, conglomerate. I mentioned the word conglomerate, right? That is an aspect of consolidation. So if you go back to the 1890s and the 1920s, what you saw were sort of predatory practices by the big industries. They would buy up the smaller industries. You see it now. You're going to continue to watch a handful of major tech companies buy up everyone else. And then it's going to get into these bizarre dilemmas where you've got Epic Games, which is a billion-dollar corporation, taking on Apple, which is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. It's like the battle of the giants. It's not David and Goliath. It's Goliath and another Goliath fighting. But there's going to be a lot more of that. So during the 50s and 60s, lots of consolidation. And, they're going to make a lot of money. They're going to record gains on Wall Street. Most of them, the newest growth are going to be companies like Dow, DuPont, Boeing, and they're companies that make stuff for the military. All right, whatever that stuff may be. And they're going to grow a lot. So remember that 10% of GNP is military spending, but it's not like the government is building this stuff. It's showered on congressional districts all across the country so that people have jobs to build the stuff for the military. Okay, so definitely be familiar with that. Today, America's we don't use the phrase white collar anymore, really. That's not typical. And really the stigma that becomes associated with blue collar by the 70s, I think is misguided. It's misinformed. So what you have in the 80s and 90s is every parent seems to want their kid to go to college. But do we really need another gender studies major, or do we really need another psychology major? They're not really hiring them down at the psychology plant. So if you can't find a way to make your degree valuable, then people are wasting their time and energy. Most people are. Yeah. Or unless you're so well-to-do that it doesn't really matter. You just get a degree on whatever you want. Another key component of the 50s was television. So if you think about the 20s and its culture and its society, it was radio, dominant radio. Well, the 50s was the first genuine decade of television. The television is actually manufactured a little bit earlier than this, but it will become first used really wholesale in the 50s. And during this period, particularly in prime time, it absolutely glorified a traditional, quote, family values. So this is the upscale version of Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity. So you guys remember that feminine sort of, what do women do? Well, they're sort of goddesses of the home, right? The cult of domesticity. And so you had these very beautiful women who were, really well dressed and really smart, and they stayed at home and they were moms, right? And that was their society. So you have the Donna Reed show, and she was, a super hit. Leave It to Beaver and the nuclear family here, the Ozzie and Harriet show, and of course, Father Knows Best. So very gender stereotypical, very defined gender roles, and that is going to create tension. And we're going to talk about this because now you have this sort of image of women as being homemakers, like this sort of 50s iconic mom. But a lot of moms in the 50s are working. And so it's a lot harder to be a, soccer mom of the 50s. They're not soccer moms. They're probably little league moms of the 50s and have a job. That's tough to do. And that's going to become a challenge that's ultimately defined by our country's first modern feminist. So this is post-World War II feminism's most famous figure. You need to know her name. It is Betty Friedan. She wrote an absolutely significant work called The Feminine Mystique. And what Friedan argued is that women had all of these responsibilities and they were in essence trapped in the home. So a woman could not be a strong individual. A woman could not be a strong person in the workforce because society said you have to be a stay-at-home mom. And she said for millions and millions of women, this was not enough. It was not enough simply to be a mom. Like particularly like if you're a college graduate with skills in writing or something else. So her book becomes an absolute bestseller. It is very controversial, of course, at the time. But here you see women who were protesters in the 50s were very sort of domestic looking. They dressed in very like conformist clothing. They've got their kids in their strollers, and they're protesting. And they want to be involved in society more than trapped in the cul-de-sac, so to speak, or trapped in suburbia. And Betty Friedan is going to help create an organization called the National Organization of Women now, and they're going to really spearhead the next wave of feminism. But she's early. She's going to become like the sort of iconic figure of this period in history's feminism. So what about these gender roles? Well, I told you that this was a revolutionary period in the study of sexuality already. So this guy, Alfred Kinsey, he's really a bizarre guy. I've read his book, one of his books, and I've actually watched a biopic on him. Kinsey was a professor at the University of Indiana, not a hotbed of liberalism. And he was an absolute expert on gall wasps, right? What's an insect doctor called? An insect specialist? I don't remember. Anyway, he was an insect specialist. That was his thing. A bug professional. And he had spent the better part of a decade cataloging every type of gall wasp that ever was on the planet, basically. But he was like this entomologist. Is that it? Entomologist. Okay. Yeah. So he was an entomologist. And somebody probably typed it. I didn't read it. No. You wrote about Betty Friedan this morning? Awesome. Way to go. Keeping you up to date there. Huh? So anyway, this guy wants to take but when he puts out his monumental study on gall wasps, and nobody cares. Like nobody reads it. Ooh, you're an expert on gall wasps. So he's like, all right, well, that went over like a lead balloon. So he's at a dinner party and people are talking sort of casually about things, relationships, and he gets an idea that no one had ever done a study of human sexuality. You understand? Like an actual scientific study. Freud, of course, had written about it in psychiatry and psychology terms, but nobody had actually studied statistics of sexual activity. Right. Well, you weren't supposed to ask people. I mean, this was not the kind of stuff you talked about. All right. So you weren't supposed to be people who were engaged in conversations about sexuality. And so that led to a study where he and his students went around and actually interviewed prostitutes, male and female. They interviewed couples in private, like family, like normal families. They would say, this is we'll record that you are this kind of like a 28-year-old employed man, Caucasian, but they wouldn't say who the person was, because people were alarmed by that. Right. And so the very first one comes out in 1948, and it was absolutely stunning. I mean, it blew people's mind. One of the things that was overwhelmingly reflected was the number of extramarital and premarital sex activity that was going on in America. Like people didn't realize, they kind of thought that people saved it till marriage, so to speak, that expression. But there wasn't any sort of data to say that otherwise. So when he does this study, it's absolutely mind blowing because he finds that many people engage, and I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, and I wouldn't want to promote one thing or another, but he writes that it was absolutely normal for people to have extramarital relations and premarital relations. Like that was a typical thing in America. Not just young people either. But what was particularly stunning, I think, was he also studied homosexuality. And I'm going to put in the data that Kinsey came up with. Now, there have been critics of his study and said that was flawed, perhaps. But according to the Kinsey Institute, I'm looking at it right here, 37% of males and 13% of females had at least some homosexual activity, like encounter. That didn't necessarily mean they were gay, but it certainly did mean that the argument could be made by his study that a third of all men had been homosexual or engaged in homosexuality. That was stunning. People are like, and it was absolutely scandalous. So nobody would print his book. And he was like, look, I'm just trying to report on the data I found. Like, I'm not trying to promote this or encourage. This is just what I found in my study. And so the Kinsey study became really famous, primarily because it was so controversial. Now, Kinsey himself engaged in some, I consider, risky behavior in terms of sexually. He at one point, Kinsey seemed to become interested in participating in his study. But no one is more, I think, fascinating to study during this period. And this is actually one of his students, was a couple. It was a nurse and a physician who did a study on sexual activity, on actually, what happens when you have sex, i.e. the sort of physical, that had never been studied. And so this was really extraordinary. And these two people named are Masters and Johnson. And so the Masters and Johnson study and the Kinsey study shocked the American public because, you weren't supposed to talk about this kind of stuff. Sex was taboo, right? Well, it is, I think it's a lot less so in the American public today.
It's still pretty taboo, but compared to that time.
But compared to the 50s, the Leave It to Beaver era, this was not a period where, you had open conversations about homosexual rights, for example. You would never have heard that. So when you find out people were gay all around you, quote unquote, people are like, that's not true. They absolutely denied that being possible. When adults came to Masters and Johnson and the Kinsey study and asked for sexual education. So the thing about it is there was no sexual education in America at this point. And to be blunt, there was no pornography either, which is not good sexual education, but a generation of young people are learning from apparently. But nonetheless, the people in America wanted to be taught, so to speak, about the science of sexuality. And these were the first to do it. But again, highly controversial because you weren't supposed to be talking about this. That's not acceptable conversation. Look at what Life magazine writes. An assault on the family as a unit of society, a negation of moral law, and a celebration of licentiousness, which is corrupt living or sinful living. I would wonder, are you familiar with the expression shooting the messenger? Yeah, where you attack the person who delivers information you don't like.
Yeah, rather than the person who caused the information.
Well, no, I mean, this is the person who calls the information. In other words, Kinsey is the guy who studies this stuff.
Right.
So he's the one that gets attacked. Yep. But, Kinsey's going to argue as a scientist. It's I just approached this scientifically. All I asked was what are people doing? Tell me what your sexual activity is like as a study. And people are like, we're not interested in that study. That's not something we should be studying, they said. So be familiar with the fact that this was not a period where people were open and frank about their sexuality at all. It was also a period where people wanted to spend a lot of money. How do you define your success? You spend money. And if you recall anything about the 20s, it was bought on layaway, right? Remember how you pay money down and then pay the rest later? Well, in the 1950s, we invent credit cards.
Yeah.
That makes that a whole lot easier. And you should know the nation's first credit card. It is called the Diners Club card. It was literally like a membership, and when you went to restaurants, you could, if they were a member of the Diners Club, you could use that to purchase your meals, and you got an incentive reward and paid for it later. And that was an absolutely breakthrough moment in the American consumer world, because after this, you're going to have the development of Visa and MasterCard, right? And so credit purchasing by the 1950s and 60s is going to be so much easier than it was in the 20s, right? And lots of growth of credit, and people are going to use this credit all the time, right? Now, I do feel like I should go back and talk about the baby boom here, since I'm talking about consumer culture, and also because I didn't quite finish it yesterday. I feel like you guys need to hear this, particularly because I've always discovered with students is they're frequently interested in their generation, like generational stuff. All right. And so let me put a couple slides in right here about the 50s and 60s with children, because this will be the first decade in history that will be defined by young people. Like, if you think about our class so far, we haven't really talked about teenagers much, right? Like, occasionally I'll mention something teenagers do, but by and large, we hadn't been talking about this. Well, this has to do with the fact that as the baby boom grows, they are going to become consumers. And as parents have this thing called disposable income, that's a funny word, right? Then they're going to shower that money on young people. And this is going to create a whole consumer society. So during this period, young people in the 60s and late 50s are going to be in school. Schools will reach the highest point they've ever been in numbers. But look at the bottom. In the 40s and 50s, you had the invention of things like Gerber. What's Gerber? Baby food, right? What are Pampers?
Diapers.
But they're disposable.
Right.
You had diaper services before that. You did laundry, right? And you will during the 50s too, but you're going to have disposable diapers, right? So in the 40s and the 50s, the industries targeted moms, particularly at the grocery store, in tons and tons of baby products and little baby infants. But in the 60s, the big growth industry was in new kind of clothes and rock and roll music. So record players and albums and LPs, all this stuff is going to sell by like gazillions, okay? And then in the 80s, those people had kids, right? And so then the marketing was towards the adults of the 80s, and the me generation they're called too, and their kids, right? And so today, if you think about it wasn't people like me sitting around saying we need a nicer phone or we want our games in our pocket, right? It was your generation that really drove this, right? And it will continue. What industry has replaced the American movie industry as one of the top 3 media industries? Well, that's one of the media industries. Video gaming.
Oh, yeah.
Video gaming has skyrocketed in your generation, right? Like when I was a kid, you got the Atari 2600, right? Like, and if you were lucky, your friends could come over and play with you after school, right? Now you can play till the wee hours of the morning with 30 people all around the world, right? There has never been a period in history of gaming quite like this. So we now have what is much more a youth consumer culture.
Yes.
All right. And some of the other elements of it are going to be the automobile, which starts in the 50s. Okay. So I put in here I don't know where I lifted this from, but it's a really cool sort of generational gap picture here of what each generation kind of considers important. So keep in mind the so-called greatest generation, and I have a lot of respect for these people. The greatest generation are the people who grew up in the Depression of World War II. And that's a very tough challenge, but a lot of times those people kind of, today they're passed away. You don't see too many of those people anymore because they're 80 plus now, all right, or even 90. These would be the people who actually fought in World War II, or people who lived through the Depression, and they're called in history the greatest generation. Keep in mind, if you call a generation the greatest generation, you ought to put it like a parenthetically so far, like. The idea of saying a greatest generation, I consider it defeatist, meaning, okay, nothing ever going to be as good as those folks who lived through World War II and the Depression. But they were remarkable people, don't get me wrong, as a generation. Here are the boomers, and they certainly are in here, and they have I love some of these, like the life-altering events that are in here. How do you get around? So millennials get around by Lyft. iGen gets around by mom's Prius. A Gen Xer gets around by a handmade Dutch bicycle. So it's sort of like hipster people, right? Preferred mode of communication, they've got over here, guilt-induced phone call, lawsuit, text, selfie, and Snapchat, which I think now it's, like you said, TikTok, right? Like some things I do leave to the younger generation. Like it's, I don't even use social media anymore. You know, so the last thing I want to do is get on social media where people are silly and send it around each other. Like, yeah, congratulations. But hey, you know, each generation, like, okay, Gen Xer. You know, here's some of the defining condition: permanently aggressive, erectile dysfunction, attention deficit, gluten intolerant, peanut allergy. So, you know, I mean, it is kind of interesting to see some of these things. Deepest fear in the greatest generation was America in 2015. For boomers, it's no longer being the center of the universe. For my generation, it's how to pay off grad school loans. For the generation before you guys was everybody doesn't get a trophy. And for you guys' generation, your deepest fear is a low battery. Yeah, it's like a super meme. It is absolutely. And so the point is, though, is I think it's like a teaching meme, you know, like in the sense that there are substantive differences between generations. All right, generation gaps, right? And I mentioned to you guys that the baby boom created like a bulge. Like imagine a snake swallowing a pig, and as the pig moves through the snake, it kind of swells. That's been the baby boom through the American demographic study. And today, the baby boom is kind of at the end of the tail. Baby boomers now are in their 70s, right? And so those boomers are retired. And so now the industry for these people is healthcare, retirement homes, and travel, right? Like that's the big three. And so if you look at growth industries in America right now, well, not travel, thank you, pandemic, but even so, selling RVs are through the roof right now, recreational vehicles. Oh, yeah, because you can do that during the pandemic and you can go to the beach and be, oh, yeah, they're very popular. So, you know, every generation that the baby boom progresses through, the almost the entire society's like culture is angled towards them. You know, so you're going to see in your generation a whole demand of how to take care of old people. It's already there. It's just going to get worse, you know, as old people get older. And so that's what the medical care, like why is nursing exploding? Pre-COVID, it's because of lots of demands for the elderly, you know. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about economics. So let's keep going. The 50s was the first generation of the car, right? The car. And Americans who, you know, the 20s had the car, don't get me wrong, but that car was the Model T, and it was fairly limited, and then the Depression happened. The cars of the 50s create a new form of mobility because they coincide at the exact same time. President Eisenhower is going to sign into law the National Interstate Highway Act, right? And so you're going to have, for the first time, interstates being built across the United States, right? And I'll talk about that more later. So one of the things that you knew that we had become an odd society, you knew that we had become a culture that had changed, was in 1955 in Anaheim, California, Disneyland was created. Now, Disneyland had elements of the Disney movies of their era and the Disney show pictures, things like, you know, the Magic Kingdom. But one of the neatest things to me about Disneyland was it had a model America in it. So rather than live in the frontier, you went and visited Frontierland at Disneyland, right? The model nature. And so you see that now sort of culture had become almost touristy, if that makes sense. So, and then of course they had Tomorrowland. So you could walk through each of these phases of America. You could go to a destination. And so Disney is going to explode during this period. And most of the people who got there came, of course, by car, right? Okay, now Disney is even much bigger, right? A bigger conglomerate. So I snuck a picture in here because I love how some of Disney's work does. It's very sort of, you know, sneaky. Yes. So, for example, the movie Cars, it's tremendous because Cars captures the dilemma that the 50s created. The interstates were superhighways, right? And they took you to these big places that connected the big places in America. But the small places in America, in a lot of cases, shrunk, right? And stopped being places people went. And then the other thing that America did during this period, and it's very much a part of the conformity of the era, was we became greatly homogeneous, right? Homogeneous. And by that I meant you could drive from town to town and eat in a restaurant that was basically the same. Because before, restaurants were things that individuals owned, proprietary on the spot. But starting in the 50s in Anaheim, right down the road from Disneyland, right? The McDonald's brothers had their company name bought. They sold their company name to a guy who sold milkshake makers. Ray Kroc, that's right. And Ray Kroc had come up with the idea of having the same milkshake maker in all of his restaurants. That way, anywhere you went, you'd get the same milkshake, right? Well, when he tasted the McDonald's burger and fries and thought they were really good, and so he said, well, I should take them everywhere. And so what he did was he took the name McDonald's and he franchised it, which means you could buy the name of the company. But not only did you get the name, you had to replicate the exact production that was going on in the other McDonald's. So you had to make your hamburgers exactly the same as the other McDonald's. You had to make your French fries. And today we're very aware of franchises, right? Like, you know, if you go to Burger King or Hardee's in Florida or in New York, you expect basically the same burger, right? Well, that's Ray Kroc, that's McDonald's. And so what that means is everywhere you go becomes more and more like everywhere you were, right? And one of the things I don't like about Danville is we get all fired up when the next Starbucks or Chili's or whatever comes here. I'm like, well, that's what everywhere else has. Like, who cares? We don't need to be like everybody else, but that's conformity, right? That's that idea that we're missing out somehow if we go to a mom and pop's coffee shop, right? As opposed to a corporation. And you know, this is when that starts, where, you know, everywhere looks like everywhere else. You have the first time motels that are franchised, and these are the Howard Johnson motels. So basically any Howard Johnson was just like any other Howard Johnson. But that gave you sort of, there's a great book written in the 70s, I think it was, called The Accidental Tourist. And in The Accidental Tourist, these were Americans who, when they traveled to Europe, wanted to not feel like they'd left America. So they wanted to eat at the same restaurants they were used to in America.
They wouldn't feel like they went nowhere.
They didn't travel. It was on work, right? Well, now people could basically go all over the country and not feel like they'd left. Because you can stay in the same hotel, you can say eat in the same restaurant, so to speak, and you know, nothing really changed that much. And so this became a very much new part of the culture that wasn't there before World War II. And then, you know, the movie drive-ins were absolutely fascinating. You know, these are a cultural phenomenon where people, like, if you've never been down to Eden or to the drive-in, it's really a neat thing where you can sit and there are other people in their cars watching on this huge mega screen. So those are called drive-in theaters. Now, I mentioned TV, and I showed you some of those famous family role shows. But look at the numbers here. So one of the huge industries of the 50s was appliance stores. And one of the most popular things to buy was a television. Like, that was a measure of middle-class status. And you know, everybody had a kind of big TV in their living room with the antennas on them, you know. This was pre-cable. Now, initially, there wasn't that much on TV, as you might imagine. There were no 24-hour news or channels. There was no cable. And so you would get some pretty bizarre shows, like people were putting out. So the government had to step in and say, and when I say bizarre, I mean like scandalous, and say, we're going to create rules to govern television. Okay. And at this point, they're going to set up sort of the standards, we now call them, that are acceptable for TV, like no profanity, no nudity, nothing like that, right? So very common, and frequently there were a couple types of TV shows that created sort of the ideal or idealized understanding of America. So, for example, Superman. You know, Superman was the kid that I were watching that awful Superman versus Batman movie the other day, but we were talking about why I told him why I didn't like Superman. He didn't really have any flaws. I mean, kryptonite was so rare, like, but Superman was like Captain America. You know, he was like an American hero, you know, in a sense. And there was very much, you know, the red, white, and blue kind of thing with both those heroes. So that stuff was highly promoted, and you know, it made for some cool cultural stuff. The Western, you know, the Western became an absolute, you know, normal midday watching. Before soaps, there were the Westerns, right? And primetime had Westerns too, like Gunsmoke. And here's the Lone Ranger, and you know, Davy Crockett, and there were Bonanza. There were tons of Westerns throughout the 50s and 60s. And it glamorized life on the frontier. It glamorized white cowboys versus red Indians. They were the Redskins, you know, the villains. And it was usually a fairly predictable adventure story that went through the same sort of stuff over and over, but hugely popular and kind of built on an American tradition of the West. You also had a very new idea called the sitcom. And you got to love comedy, right? And so the sitcom of things like I Love Lucy and The Honeymooners were hilarious. And usually they were sort of lampoonish, meaning like physical comedy, sometimes sort of outrage. But one of the neat things about it was Lucy was married to Desi and they had the full middle class lifestyle. Ralph Cramden drove a bus and what was his buddy? Ed Norton was a garbage, like he worked in sanitation department. So they were like poor people living their life through comedy kind of thing. And, everybody else was like upper middle class. Now, another major cultural component of the 50s is religion. And of course, religion is never not a component of American history. This is one of those moments in history where you have the emergence of the televangelists. And during the 50s, you see a massive revival. Look at the number of people who joined churches from 40 to 60. So you're talking about 50 million people. That's a staggering number. All right. And you had several key religious leaders. And I put this picture up here so you can see. This is Billy Graham in one of his stadium shows. So Billy Graham, I say show, ministry, he would actually go to like Yankee Stadium and sell out Yankee Stadium in a revival. So you're talking about like one guy preaching to an entire arena. And that was enormous. Never have we seen people with that level of success. Books like The Power of Positive Thinking were highly popular. And please know Billy Graham. This was a guy whose message of Christianity would often be laced with contemporary political commentary. Well, if you're talking about Satan being active in the world, which he certainly did, and you equate the villainy of the communists with that, then that would be a way to preach that. Now, again, he didn't usually overtly endorse candidates. And so Billy Graham will be an advisor to every president from Harry Truman to, I think he died during President Obama's presidency. So, like that, you're talking about 60 years of spiritual advice to the leaders of our country, on both parties. And Billy Graham was one of the most respected individuals probably in all the United States. Now, his son Franklin, who's in this picture beside President Carter, has become much more politically active than Billy Graham. Billy Graham was never sort of an overt partisan. Like that was not his thing. He didn't believe in that. But he did believe, and I'll enlarge this quote of his. It says here, the legacy we leave behind for our children, grandchildren, and this great nation is crucial. As I approach my 94th birthday, I realize this election, he's talking about Obama's, could be my last. I believe it's vitally important that we cast our ballots for candidates who base their decisions on biblical principles and support the nation of Israel. I urge you to vote for those who protect the sanctity of life and support the biblical definition of marriage between a man and a woman. So that's associated with him. And this is the beginning, although I would argue that Billy Graham usually was not associated with overt with politics. As he got older and we have what were called the culture wars, I think it would have been really hard for any Christian minister during this period to not oppose things like abortion and gay marriage. That became a much more recent development. But I put that in there to show at the end of his life, he still had a great influence. And I'm talking about millions of people listening to and reading Billy Graham's sermons and his messages. So he had a great impact on America, particularly during this period. And so Christianity was kind of back in full swing. But it coincided with the sort of material comfort of the 50s, and that made for an interesting pair. Now, here you see Hollywood got in on the action. Like Hollywood was like, well, wait a minute. If so many people are Christian, that means they want to see Christian stuff on the big picture. And so you have multiple movies made, most famously The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur. But they call these sandal epics, right? Like sandal movies. And they would have vast sets and these huge scenes that would be created, these Bible epics. And so that became part of the definition of America. This motif became very consistent for a whole lot of people with Americanism. Keep in mind, this is the decade in which we put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance and in God we trust as a national motto. Eisenhower was overtly religious, like he talked about religion a lot. So interesting change. And I mentioned arenas before. There's another change, not related to Christianity, but related to where people moved. Right. So sports and professional sports are going to reflect a major shift westward. The Giants are going to move to San Francisco, and perhaps most notably, the Dodgers are going to leave Brooklyn and go to Chavez Ravine. They're going to go to LA, right? And so you now have the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants, which used to both be New York-based teams, right? And so you're seeing a sort of shift to the Sun Belt, right? Remember that transformation? And that will go on with sports a lot during this period as well. Now, one of the things I really do dig about the 50s is the stuff that teenagers of the 50s like. You understand? Like the teen culture, if you want to call it that, was pretty hip to me. So starting with a book that came out in 51. Now, a lot of young people don't like Catcher in the Rye. I think it's kind of busy and the language is kind of dated. And it probably is because it was written in 1951. But it's a story of a very disillusioned young man who is sort of drifting. He doesn't like all the conformity of the people he goes to school with. So in many ways, if I had to characterize all of these stories, all three of these, it's sort of what we would today call teen angst, right? Yeah. Like the idea of the anxiety of youth. And by that, these young people found all of this obsession with materialism particularly like not pleasant. They didn't like it. Like they didn't like the fact that they were expected to do exactly what their parents told them to do, and that was very narrow in terms of they wanted to be in their cars and run around and hang out with young ladies and doing the stuff that young people typically want to do, and they were not being allowed to do that. And so you had most famously Holden Caulfield's story of The Catcher in the Rye. You have Marlon Brando, who became the embodiment of this sort of angry young man of the 50s. If you don't know who the actor Marlon Brando is. And then the great James Dean, who's only going to have 3 movies come out in his lifetime before he dies in a car crash. So he becomes an American icon after 3 movies. But his most famous movie at the time, Rebel Without a Cause. And he's a teenager who the normal kids find him weird because he's an outsider, right? It's always the outsiders who by the way, write the stories and make the music and write and make the movies, right? It's
the outsiders.
They're the least conformist, they're the least trying to keep up with everybody else. They're the ones who want to kind of express their own identity. I'm not saying they didn't get the idea from someone else, but usually it's a little more obscure. That's where teen angst. These are young people who feel like the world they live in, they don't fit into it, and so that's why these films and this book particularly are so popular. One of the other things they began to pursue in earnest was music. Now, music existed in the 20s. The Flappers went to jazz, and obviously there's big band. But one of the things that had become popular but was not allowed to be played was black music. And by black music, I mean African-American musicians. So I have they called it, and you can see it right here, race music. So let me show you one of the great all-time figures of American music. And his name, I'll put the picture up here first because I realize that your book, for whatever reason, does what it does. This is one of my all-time favorite guitar players. He was really creative and brilliant. And, his music began to be played in black radio stations, right? And there were black recordings. And when I say black, I mean like white people weren't supposed to listen to this stuff. Like they were not. Like when I say supposed to, polite society did not let you listen to Chuck Berry, and they certainly didn't want you to listen to a guy named Little Richard because, Little Richard dressed flamboyantly. He wore extraordinarily garish clothing and makeup, right? Like makeup be particularly controversial. And he actually sang about sexual stuff, which you're not supposed to do, right? You're not supposed to sing. Now, he did it in code. Does anybody know any Little Richard tunes?
It's basically.
It is, but it isn't. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Nobody knows any Little Richard, huh? Oh, wow. All right. So perhaps let me go through. There's a very famous song that Little Richard wrote called Tutti Frutti, right? Tutti Frutti all wrote it. All right. Well, that was about a gay person, and so he's writing, about being a fruit. That was their language, this kind of thing. So he's writing about gay people hooking up. He's writing about sex. And he's using church music as the music background, but he's singing these really racy songs. Black, I'm not going to tell you if you're ever curious. There are some really, really controversial songs written in the 30s and 40s by African Americans that were overtly about sex, like they were sexual in nature. And so teenagers liked this stuff. And you had a DJ in, of all places, Cleveland, Ohio. What? Cleveland, Ohio. And his name was Alan Freed. And man, he looked like the last person you would expect to be like a hip rock and roller. This is Alan Freed. And Alan Freed decided one day he would just start playing, for lack of a better word, black people music. And teenagers loved it in Cleveland. And when the parents found out that these singers were black, they got outraged. So you can't be a white teenage girl listening to a black guy sing about sex. That is absolutely inappropriate, right? Or taboo. So what you had was Elvis had a manager, a guy named Colonel Tom Parker. And Colonel Tom Parker recognized, here he is for my students here at home, in school. This guy, Colonel Tom Parker, heard this young man sing named Elvis. And this is Colonel Tom Parker, and he's literally is kind of a grifter, as that name implies. But Colonel Tom Parker heard this young man from Memphis singing church music and blues music one day. And he was like, this guy could sing the black people songs as a white person, and he will be a megastar. And he was right. Yeah. So Elvis started recording his own songs that other people had written, and African-American songs. And he became an absolute superstar. I can't tell y'all. He's the king of rock and roll, right? He is the most famous. But I will tell you that he wasn't the first. And very quickly, once these guys start taking off, right? Hank Williams, whose music was sort of what we call today boogie woogie, like it was rock in country form, right? And so Hank Williams was singing about getting drunk and about his girl leaving him and stuff like that. And so country music was beginning to turn a little more controversial too. And so during this period, rock and roll will be born. Now I'm going to get into the 60s and talk about rock and roll a lot later, okay, and how the evolution of that music. It is no coincidence, by the way, folks, that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame of the United States is in Cleveland, Ohio. And it's there because that's where white people started listening to rock and roll for the very first time, because this DJ played these guys' music, which no one else would do. So I think it's kind of neat how this guy took a risk, Alan Freed. What else was teen culture? Well, this is what you were supposed to do. Obey authority, don't have emotional outbursts, fit in, conform, and never, ever think about sex, right? So it's kind of like what you think grown-ups are like probably now. But in all honesty, this was really sort of deep, every part of society. Like you didn't have an outlet to go to that said, well, what you're feeling is normal. Everyone told you what you're feeling makes you weird. So this is the kind of period where you wanted to be accepted. You guys as young people understand how this works. I don't have to tell you all about peer pressure and conformity and all the social pressures that occur in life. But it's certainly human nature. And moving on down to the idea of gender, this is the other thing of the 50s that I absolutely love, and that's Marilyn Monroe. Now, I thought about putting the very first edition of Playboy's cover right here, and then I said, I'm not going to do that. But Marilyn Monroe appeared on the cover of Playboy, the very first magazine, the first edition, and it was a absolute best, superstar seller. And this is where you had this bizarre situation where you had, this is what life said a woman should be. A woman should be married, cooked, take care of her family, keep herself busy by joining the PTA, which is, for schools, Parent-Teacher Association, leading a troop of campfire girls, think like, Girl Scouts. She entertained guests in her suburban house and worked on the trampoline to keep her size 12 figure. Now today, our culture and society says you got to have a 2 figure, which is ridiculous. Size 2 if you're a woman, and stuff like that, which is not realistic. Marilyn Monroe comes along, and she utterly shatters that normal perception. So, what is an average woman dress size in America? Right? I think it's probably at least a 12. Maybe more than that. Today it's a 14. Right? 14. So fairly consistent. Although it says majority of clothing lines stop at 12. So what was normal in the 50s, a size 12, is now way too big, by our society standards. So that's another thing that's interesting, by fashion standards. But what size was Marilyn Monroe dress size? She was in the 7-Year Itch. That's the one you see the picture of. It was let's see if y'all can see it. It's a great movie if you've never seen that movie. Is that true? Doesn't say it right here. I wanted y'all to get a sense of like Marilyn Monroe is absolute, would probably not be a superstar today. And that's hard to imagine. She was, let's see here, the Marilyn Monroe collection says, this kind of stuff I think is interesting. Maybe you don't. Here's Elizabeth Hurley, who's 55 years old and has just become the most clicked on person in the last year as far as, but she's a 55-year-old supermodel. All right, she's amazing. But she says, I've always thought Marilyn Monroe looked fabulous, but I'd kill myself if I was that fat. I went to see her in her clothes and exhibition. I want to take a tape measure and measure what her hips were. She was very big. So according to her modeling agency, she was a size 12 in 1945, and then they never put her size down again, it looks like. So she was at least a 16 or bigger. But it was about her sexuality. It wasn't about her literal measurements. It was about the fact that she just projected sexuality. She was a very, we call them today sex symbols, or what they call them then, that sex symbol. So women had this really controversial sort of reality that they lived in. And that's like, men adored Marilyn Monroe, but you couldn't look like that if you were a mom, right? You couldn't be Marilyn Monroe. You had to be Donna Reed and the mothers, and those kind of things. So this was, yet again, society sending mixed messages. Culture saying, you're supposed to be a nice stay-at-home mom and do the polite thing. Oh, by the way, we're going to make millions and millions of dollars off Marilyn Monroe and other women that look similar to her. What was a man's role? His role was the provider, the protector. I grew up in a house where my father was the major breadwinner. Like he brought home almost all the money. So my mom was basically in charge of everything else. She was still the sort, and she was a French teacher, but she didn't make that much money. And so she had to do, clothes, food, cleaning, and it was and you may have been a family get together where like the women gathered in one room and prepared food and taught, and the men all hung out and watched TV, right? Like we still have very defined gender roles. Now, of course, they're more fluid today than they were in the 1950s, but this was you weren't supposed to be outside of the norm. You're middle class, white, suburbia. And so this really pops up in writing. So you should be familiar with these books, particularly The Organization Man and these two, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and The Lonely Crowd. All three of these books deal with the topic of men were supposed to conform. And basically, there's a really fun movie called Revolutionary Road that's out there on, somewhere. And Revolutionary Road has Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet of Titanic fame back together again. And in this movie, they play a 50s couple, right? Who are projecting this image, and he works as a company man. He wears the gray flannel suit. You could wear any shirt you wanted to work as long as it was white, right? So that you weren't supposed to in any way be interesting, unique, different. Everybody was part of, almost like a cog in the wheel, so to speak, machine. And that's why it's a lonely crowd. And you would see these office spaces that were, I think your book has one, that were like just rows and rows and rows of workers, right? On page 854. So it was kind of impersonal. Today, I love the direction that white collar jobs are going now. They're much more, like I don't have to wear a suit and tie. I don't have to wear a top, like a hat. You don't have to, it's more individualistic to a degree. And back then, the whole idea was you were supposed to comport to this, okay? Now, all of this leads to a society that's sort of being redefined. Prior to the 20th century, certainly prior to the 1920s, you would have been hard-pressed to think of America as a consumption society. You understand? Today, and since the 50s, our economy has been driven by consumer consumption. All right. And that is going to lead to a backlash. Now, not in the 50s by the people of the 50s, but a handful of intellectuals like Galbraith are going to write books saying, wait a minute, we're the most affluent people on earth who have abject poverty in our country. Like, how is this possible? How can we be this rich? How can people live like this? Right? Well, not so much that, but oh, okay, back here somewhere. Yeah, you know, the family life. This is I think, a reality, but it was also a sort of, it was way out of reach for these kind of people. And by that, I mean poor people and people of color frequently, you know, black and brown particularly. And so, you know, there's no way like the American way. And here you see people lined up for assistance. Okay. So we had the world's highest standard of living, but that was not something that extended down to everyone. Great division between these two cultural societies. That has today been written about. I have the first edition of this book. When I got married and got out of college, I made a personal decision to not be very much of a consumer. I did not want to buy stuff. When I went to college, I didn't want to have a job where I would buy stuff, sell stuff, or make stuff. Right? I didn't want to do that. Right? And so since then, I've adopted kind of what's called minimalism. And one of the reasons for this is the absolute massive amount of waste we generate as a country. We just are we throw things out as if out were a real place. There is no such place as out. Virginia imports garbage from other states. I think this is terrible. Our county imports garbage to our landfill. We get paid for that. So we're going to fill up our county with other people's trash, right? Or our state with other people's trash. And this is the problem we get in. We produce so much waste. This is the period in history where we stop repairing and we start throwing things away. You don't get your shoes repaired, you just replace them. And it's just gotten worse and worse. My TV stopped working the other week, and I could not get it repaired. Like, it was not going to be no one would repair it for cheaper than the price of a new TV. It was just unbelievable. So this is what is now known in history as affluenza. It is the virus of the affluent, meaning, how do you define if you're successful? How much crap you have. Like the Egyptians, right? Like, you can't take it with you. So I embraced minimalism and rejected this. And I've taught about the negativity side of this for a long time. Now, in poor societies, you don't have to worry about it, you know, because they're poor. They don't have this stuff. But we have a problem of rich society. And this is a fairly new concept in history, where the bulk of the people of a society have a ton of stuff. And, you know, that creates so much waste and so much destruction in the process. But it makes a lot of money for people. Now, we're going to talk about this more than once, this chapter, but another group that really resented the 50s culture of conformity and materialism were a group of writers. And these writers were absolutely astonishing at the time. These were not like other writers ever before. They were called the Beats. And the Beats were the beginning of what history now calls the counterculture, the group that says, we're going to be an alternative to the mainstream culture of America. Right? So they're called the Beat Generation. It's a collection of authors. Several of them were gay and wrote about being gay. That was unusual. They all used drugs, usually hallucinogenic drugs. So these were the first people to write about LSD, for example. And they were absolutely critical of the contemporary society of the 50s and 60s. Many of these will go on to become protesters of the Vietnam War and part of the civil rights. By far the most noted work is On the Road, this book here by Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac dropped out of mainstream society and just hitchhiked. Like, he's like, I don't want to live in this society. There's been a film and book written in my lifetime that sort of deals with a similar topic. And it's a book called Into the Wild. You may or may not have heard of it. It's by a guy named Krakauer, but it's the story of a young man who graduated from Georgia Tech and then just wandered into the wilderness and ended up in Alaska and died there in the wilderness. You know, he just said, I don't want to be a part of this society. So this was a group of people who openly rejected mainstream society. Look at what Allen Ginsberg writes in his book. He dedicates it to another Beat named Carl Solomon, Howl. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. That's heroin. Right? Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of a night. So that poem is called Howl, and it's published in the 50s, and it's an absolute, you know, big hit for the future, not at the time. Probably the most successful of all of these writers is William S. Burroughs. He goes on to write science fiction, and all kinds of cool stories. But this is his first major work. He's writing under a pseudonym, William Lee, and the book is called Junkie, Confessions of an Unredeemed Drug Addict, right? So lots of writing about controversial material overtly, not covering this stuff up. We would, these things would be banned then as pornography or as inappropriate for anyone. Today, I've got Howl back there, and I've used it in multiple classes before. So be familiar with the beats. And then tomorrow, rather Monday, we will pick up with the Eisenhower administration. So we only made it through about the first 16 questions. It didn't help to have the code red, but in many ways, this is throughout the 50s and the late 40s. The stuff I've been talking about. It's not particularly relevant to a president or not. Okay, so you guys have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you. Hey, what's on Netflix? On the Road? Into the Wild?